What's up, everybody? So we're here. This is not going to be a traditional episode. Instead, we want to use this as an opportunity to give an idea of where we as the Infrared Collective are coming from. Because we kind of just came out of the blue. We've been getting a lot of emails and shit of people just asking us, like, where are you even coming from? Like, what is this even about, right? What's your position, our political position? So we thought we'd take this time as an opportunity to distinguish ourselves, why we got beef with the current left, and why we have problems with so-called prevailing Marxism. Now, for starters, in broad terms, we identify as Marxist-Leninists. But we also think that there's a big distinction between Marxism-Leninism as it's translated into the West and Marxism-Leninism as an index of historical experience in Russia, China, and etc. So I think we want to take this as an opportunity to kind of expand upon what we consider those crucial differences to be and why we think a new approach for Westerners is necessary in order to catch up with the experiences of Marxist-Leninist practice globally. Most of the topics that are within the scope of our analysis and our concern, and especially the angles that we're coming from and analyzing them, don't really fall within the horizon of what is traditionally called Marxist-Leninist analysis or theory as it exists in the West. But I think a few things are in need of clarification on this point. One is the question, what is Marxist-Leninist theory? And we'll use the example of the big ones, Russia and China, right? And why this is a problem translating this over into the West. And why it gives rise to mediocrity, laziness, and sterility, and an inability to really tap into any type of popular sense whatsoever in the West. So I think the best example is China, as far as this is concerned, because on the Russia, with the entanglement with the whole history of Western social democracy and stuff like that, is a little bit more complicated. So in the case of China, the question of what is Marxist-Leninist theory is only a kind of practical question in a sense. The raw material or the substance, whatever you want, to which this theory is being applied is something that a person in China can take for granted. So what is this basis? It's the Chinese national or even civilizational, whatever you want to call it, sense. Mao Zedong, when he speaks of the need to apply Marxism to Chinese conditions, he is able to take for granted his acute understanding of the Chinese situation, which may as well be shared by all Chinese people, more or less. Then Marxism-Leninism is not a question of legislating your sense from zero, but clarifying it. This is why in the East, Marxism-Leninism takes such an apparently limited scope. It's all very basic, it's all very simplified, when it's recorded. The problem is that Westerners see this and they do this kind of Cartesian reduction where they think that that's all it is, and that this can replace reality itself. But in China or in Russia or wherever you want, they're taking a reality and a sense in relation to that reality for granted. And this is what we consider, the Infrared Collective, we consider to be missing in the West. So why we're called infrared is because we're trying to tap into this sense, which is not on the visible spectrum of light. It's not on the surface. You have to have a deeper sense.
Yeah. So what basically distinguishes our position with China and Russia and the other former or current, communist states is that Marxism-leninism or socialism acquired an objectivity. That is, it was already a ground on which people could take for granted, like you said, that people stood on before they could think. And what theory's job was to clarify practical questions. So in China, it was the war for national liberation, right? To resist imperialist aggression. In Russia, it took the form not only of this, but also of catching up with the West, of industrializing. Or even returning to the being of to the being of the state, right? To the peasantry, through collectivization. Yeah, to the Russian people. But in the West, this is missing. What's instead taken place of this kind of sense, which again, it's sense because although it can be clarified by thinking, by thought, it's something that that precedes it and which gives thought direction. It's a practical question, in other words. Leftists here, they kind of begin ex nihilo. They begin without this sense. They begin with thought to then arrive at a more beautiful form of it. But they don't engage this with the objectivity that precedes them. You know what I mean? With what they're already dealing with.
Yeah, they substitute the sense with the forms of thought. They think something called Marxist-Leninist theory, which is very laid out in a very simple and concrete way. If you read the classics that are available from the experiences of Russia and China and so on, they think that's a substitute for the sense, when really that's meant to clarify some kind of already existing sense. That's why in the West, Marxist-Leninists just appear psychotic. They're cults, or they're just really enclosed. They don't have a sense of a wider reality that the people they're taking inspiration from are able to kind of have already.
And I think at the same time, this is, although it becomes explicit and objective in the form of national economy or culturally in China and Russia, this is already even apparent in Marx. It's not as if this doesn't have a precedence in Marx and Engels and in Marxist before 1917. Because what is Marx doing, right? He's clarifying, in his later work, especially with Gotha, he is critiquing prevailing social circles for a lack of what we call objective sense, right? For a lack of stake in existing reality.
Yeah, going back to Marx, I think there's a deep philosophical, or that's really tough to say, philosophical, post-philosophical, whatever you want, but there's an element to this that goes very deep in Marx. His break with not simply Hegel, but more specifically the young Hegelians, and then Feuerbach and so on, can be condensed in this critique of the reign of pure form or pure abstraction that occludes almost in a way that others have, like Kojève have pointed out, is similar to Heidegger, that occludes that aspect of reality that cannot be preemptively assimilated into any consistent form or idea or thought. So for Marx, material reality is something, it's similar to the object of what we're talking about is the sense that is able to exist in outside of the West.
It's why he talks about submitting to laws, he calls laws, but submitting to objectivity, right? Instead of getting with this kind of Cartesian subsumption of all reality to form.
But the problem with Western leftists, and this is where we really take our point of departure, is that there's something terrifying about this insight. The reason it's terrifying is because it shows you cannot preemptively be safe or comfortable in any type of position. There's no such thing as Marxist-Leninist theory that you're going to be able to take refuge from at the expense of reality. You have to immerse yourself in the whole wealth of reality, even the things that are not halal, apparently. halal or whatever, in order to prove the actual meaning of and practical significance of Marxism-Leninism, which is not to create a separate reality away from the real one, but to help clarify and distill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of putting it, because the function of Marxism, and especially I think self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninists in the United States, tankies or whatever, so-called tankies, is that see, we're the real tankies. They're the idolaters. But is that for them, Marxism is like it's a way to escape reality, to fall into like a safe, cozy kind of doctrine to which you can always retreat into. That's why they're obsessed with this purely, because aesthetic has a real deep meaning, right? And that is a part of objective sense. But they retreat into a purely detached aesthetic from China, Soviet Union, with like this obsession with like music or tanks or whatever. That's detached from the actual objectivity to the particularity of those of those phenomena. You know what I mean? It's like it for them is a haven from reality.
Again,
but
they
for them themselves, it was embedded in reality.
Again, what they do is something really perverted. Is that they accomplish this kind of Cartesian reduction of what's on the surface in China or in Russia or wherever else in the world, and they think that's it. That's the way in which I have access to the objective essence of this phenomenon, is simply identifying with the superficial appearance. What they don't understand is that underlying this appearance is a deeper sense of the objective than what can be reduced.
And that's where the dogmatism comes from, the staticness of the thought of the West, is because it's not connected.
Even during the heyday of China's Cultural Revolution, the level of obscene dogmatism that prevailed among Western Maoists, this stuff is not the stuff that can keep states together. It's not the stuff that that is possible to be in power anywhere. I mean, the thought of Western leftists, Western Marxist-Leninists, being the equivalent in the West of Russian Marxist-Leninists or Chinese Marxist-Leninists, and so on and so on. It's absurd. There's no equivalence whatsoever. These are completely different types of human beings, different types of humanity. I mean, it's a purely reflexive phenomenon in the West, but in Africa, Latin America, wherever you go, that there are Marxist-Leninists, these are people who have a profound and deep national, whatever you want to call it, sense of their own people. And this almost, in a sense, it comes first. Marxism-Leninism is just helping them clarify this reality where it appears, where the appearance of contradiction inevitably makes itself apparent. Facing contradictions is an inevitability for humanity in general. So
that's why, though, so many Western Marxists or socialists are confused by China and Russia, and they decry these communist parties as nationalists. You've given way to nationalism or whatever, but they don't get it. They don't get that the point of Marxism was to clarify what whatever they want to call nationalism, but to clarify national reality that already exists, that you can't legislate away in thought.
It's like this. The way I would respond to this is that maybe there is something arbitrary about borders that exist in some countries. They're not necessary, but there is something objective about nations. There's an objectivity to nationhood, and that objectivity may go beyond the bounds of what is traditionally considered a nation. Is China or Russia a nation? I don't think they are. Russia is a multinational civilization, and so is China. But nonetheless, these are denigrating or referring to real objective realities that are not reducible to some kind of identity. And then people, they prod and they go, what do you mean? Well, we don't want to go too far, but this is where psychoanalysis and all that kind of stuff comes in. This is where this question of what is the unconscious, and then going off of that, what does even the objective mean, right? What do we mean by the objective? Is the objective something that is only a relation to
A kind of Cartesian subject.
Not so well. If this is the subject of Lacan, right? Lacan said his subject is the Cartesian subject. Is like, in what sense is the even phrase objectivity meaningful, right? If not as the limit to a limit or the symptom of the subject, so on and so on. But then you can also critique this as subjectivist and idealist and so on and so on. I'm kind of gonna ramble, get off. You can go the opposite angle and say not necessarily, because you can also say there are symptoms in nature itself, not just symptoms for the subject. This would be where Lacan and Heidegger are conjoined, I think. Now you'll notice, we're kind of a little bit going into territory. We're dropping names, Heidegger, Lacan, and stuff. But this also raises an important point, which is that interestingly, and in a way that makes perfect, if you really are someone who talks about dialectic, you understand dialectic, this should make perfect sense, this irony. In the West, the manner by which Marxism-Leninism has been translated you've never been able to come close with people who simply just call themselves Marxist-Leninists in the West. And identify as such. Now, I'll say there are exceptions in terms of practical organizations like the Panthers, the Black Panthers, but their organization was not founded upon being Marxist-Leninist. The organization was founded upon the Black community, and Marxism-Leninism had a practical significance in relation to this pressing reality and history and so on and so on. Maybe there's other exceptions in the West similar to that follow that. But beyond that, it's really through theory, what we maybe call theory, or I don't like calling it philosophy. I think it's maybe beyond philosophy. Specifically, I think this is a position we all share, is it's been through Heidegger that something like Marxism-Leninism can be smuggled into the Western way of thinking and made legible and intelligible to the Western mind, is through Heidegger. Because why? Because through Heidegger you then have Kojève. Kojève is a very succinct, if I'm saying that right, example of how the depth and wealth of Marxism-Leninism is able to. Am I saying this right? Kojève?
I thought it was Kojève, but I don't know.
I'm such a fucking idiot, man.
It doesn't so matter. But it's not worth to
whatever. Sorry. Well, he's a very simple example of how you can just, when you read someone like Kojève, right? You get the sense that you're only on the tip of the iceberg. And then real Marxism-Leninism, like what's going on in the Soviet Union, acquires this transcendent reality, which means you don't think it's something that's reducible to the superficial forms. It's a very deep reality that can only be perceived in some way or sensed somehow through this kind of very intense, heavy kind of theory that goes, again, deep. You need something very complicated to arrive at what is simple in reality. But you will never appreciate what is simple in reality, which is the experience of Marxism-Leninism, through a simple analysis, if that makes sense. Well, but it's not just Kojève, and then you have Bataille is kind of who, surprisingly, I am more familiar with than Kojève. But some similarities between what's going on in Bataille and specifically Marxism-Leninism at the time of Bataille's heyday, the 50s, in the Soviet Union, are striking. It's never an explicit rendering of the theory, but it's more a manifestation, almost symptomally if you want, of accidentally of what the consequences of this are for thinking. And obviously Bataille goes down a route that is very peculiar to him, the tragedy and loss, and his kind of if you want to put it in simple terms, his kind of negative shit, you know. But this is only where the West is able to encounter and appreciate the depth and wealth of what we call Marxism-Leninism. It's through these very strange, eclectic, and bizarre thinkers who have ultimately drawn from Heidegger. It goes to the end. I mean, if you are a sophisticated Maoist in the West, you're probably a follower of Badiou. Badiou is someone who tells you that you can be a Maoist without being cringe. You can be a Maoist without LARPing, right? You can have an appreciation that there's a deeper reality besides this kind of clowning shit. And Badiou comes, his lineage, again, traces to Heidegger. So, I personally, if you call me Heideggerian, I don't think I would have a problem. But I don't identify this way because I think it's superfluous. I just think Heidegger is unlocking something that others can take for granted, in a way.
You know, speaking of Badiou, what I found interesting about Badiou, and also like what we're talking about in relation to like deeper sense and objectivity, is that with Badiou, you kind of see the way that a culture relates to this deeper sense. Because, you know, if you follow like a political commitment through to its final end, or an aesthetic commitment through to its final end, or even a scientific commitment, you know, fully through, what you're going to end up doing is inheriting the full like legacy and history of their culture. And so there's kind of like this unity almost between just like the common intuition of the people and then the highest, achievements of culture.
And that's... sorry.
Also, I think this essential thing that we've hit upon, the separation that Western leftists have from, this deeper objectivity, it results in a lot of auxiliary problems related to history, nationhood, and so on. So, for example, when speaking of history, a lot of Western leftists will kind of take the position of rejecting tradition, rejecting, almost literally rejecting and canceling history. But like, even if they're more moderate, they tend to, tend towards, work for progress. We're going to reject the old ways and so on. But in doing this, I think they kind of miss the point, because the entire point of something new is that it renews and rejuvenates what was meaningful about the old traditions and customs. And so they concede tradition and custom to conservatives, when in reality, the position should be, we are like truly inheriting, what the essence of our culture and our traditions are. And you can kind of see that's kind of what happened in relation to China and the USSR, because, China did not simply, copy the USSR or try to like impose the, Soviet system onto themselves. What they did is they dug deeper into their own national realities and their own culture, and like their kind of cultural and political autonomy played a really big role in the production of, Chinese-style socialism.
Yeah, they try and liquidate their own. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you continue.
I was going to say that I think that's really well put. Like, they try and liquidate their own objectivity, right? Their own the very ground they stand on. And they don't see that Marxism is a way to clarify this ground itself, to articulate it, right? Like, they try and liquidate their own being, their own existence, and they take refuge from this in the kind of cozy, if you want, I don't want to call it theoretical because it's really not, but in this kind of theoretical position, right? That's divorced from their own existence, their own being.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the national and these kinds of aspects you guys are talking about, because in the West, I think I said this before, but it's a really good way of summing it up. The thing that distinguishes it most from the experience of people in the East is that in the West, Marxism-Leninism is a kind of political Satanism. Or communism. You don't have to be Marxism-Leninism. It can be anything. It's just a type of Satanism, right? It's just a type of infantile rebelling against your surroundings and your parents. And every success of China, they see as negative. They don't see any positive. They only see as negative. But from the perspective of their own authorities and their parents and their society and so on. In other words, when China is marching on with its great successes, they only see this as a wound to their people, their own people, instead of seeing it as a success for the Chinese people. They don't understand that Marxism-Leninism only corresponds to that sense, which is bounded up with, maybe I'll speak cringe and I say this, love for the people, right? But it's just that, isn't it? And it doesn't matter how wicked or how much evil there is among them and so on. It's ultimately based in that, even your own people. It's not based in resentment. It's not based in negativity. It's not based in like this kind of satanic fuck the world and fuck everything. Maybe that's kind of anarchism where they're coming from.
It is, but I think that's why they kind of pull from the same crowds. You know what I mean?
They really
it's
do.
Like, hey, look, and in the same way, I mean, Satanism is still Christian. It's just rebellious, edgy Christianity. It's only satanic because it's in the eyes of a religious person. And the same thing with like Western, so-called Marxist-Leninists. They're still liberals or whatever. They're just doing it to be edgy.
That's what makes Western Marxists, so-called Marxist-Leninists, Western. The thing that makes them Western is not that they're too much explicitly Western. Obviously, they're not explicitly pro-Western, but the very intense negation they attempt to pose to the West, to the countries that they live in, as a whole, is still bounded up. If you only are in the negation of something, you're still entangled only with that. That's what makes you that something. You're a Westerner because you're pretending to... but that's the whole history of the West. The whole history of the West is pretending to negate itself. Right?
Yeah. And then arrive at a kind of universal position, no particularity. But the whole point of Marxism is to clarify what is particular. Who
is more Western? Who is more American? Liberals? The woman in the car we saw recently, we were talking about, a fascist? Are you gonna vote for a fucking fascist? How she said it. Or Trump. She's more American. Trump is less American. Trump is North Korean or something. I'm not gonna insult North Koreans, but you get my point. He's coming from some foreign place, Trump, right? Everyone sees that. And yet he's the one waving the American flag, not them. So, and one of our clips on our channel is like, being a moderate isn't, and maybe people are, how are these guys Marxist-Leninists, they're Maoists, how are they, what are they talking about? Bernie Sanders, the suck dem? What do they fucking say on Reddit? Suck them? Shut up. But this goes to another point, is you have to analyze the conditions by which people in the West, especially today, become identified with this radical stuff, and including this identity of being a Marxist-Leninist. What brings them to identify with it, and so on and so on. Alongside what I said about this satanic negation kind of thing, it's also as a matter of this extension of the petty and narrow political divisions that may exist in America. Specifically, after Trump was elected, you had a lot of people who were radicalized, aka they were liberals who were mad. This is how they became Marxist-Leninists. Is this a true genesis of Is this how Marxist-Leninists are made of? Is this the stuff out of which they are made? A liberal, butthurt liberal? No. if one can appreciate the meaning of Marxist-Leninist theory in the West, I guess the first, probably most important thing would be to be able to rise above the petty, superficial political positions as they may prevail. In a sense, Marxism-Leninism has always entailed a type of true centrism, not specifically between left and right, but being able to see the objectivity of the contradiction itself. And inevitably, again, as I said before, it will be left.
The way, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, it kind of cut out for me. But the way that I would even put it is that, with regards to being a kind of centrist or whatever, is being able to navigate the objective reality before you, or the particular reality before you. Now, navigate it, not simply take this position because it is, the most left wing or something, but being able to navigate your position. That's why someone like Jimmy Hoffa, who was a labor organizer, was not like a leftist, so to speak. Objectively, sure, but like he was able to. He
had the body of maybe an American Maoist or something. He just didn't have the head of one. But in America, It's all head. That sounds weird. In America, it's all here, right? It's not the objective, the body. It's not that kind of reality. The two are permanently in a state of estrangement, and that's why it's a tragedy in America. Because when you see manifestations of the raw material of some kind of Maoism, you even see it in Trump, and maybe in 2016. I don't know about now. You even saw it there. It's always estranged from the intellectual articulation, which is where? In the university with all these stupid people, right? The head and the body are estranged, and this is the estrangement that gives rise to dialectic sense. It's the contradiction, right? But I won't veer into that.
It's almost better when you don't begin. I'm not saying it's always better. I mean, for me, it was a little bit different, but like, it's almost better when you don't begin as a Marxist. You know what I mean? Like, if you begin from somewhere else, if you even look at the history of what revolutionaries are made of, they come from backgrounds which you don't see today.
In the West, I think
seminary school. Right?
In the West,
conservatives,
I think the people who would make the best Marxist-Leninists are ones who originally come from a semi-conservative,
religious,
religious, conservative, traditional, whatever background. Initially, that's another thing, is that when I say see past the petty political division, I don't mean withdraw and dismiss it all and suck them or whatever the fuck they're saying. I'm saying distill the true essence from the appearance. Don't be caught up in the false appearance of the division. Don't get involved in this kind of stuff where I'm on the side of the liberals. You have to have a higher sense where you're able to see sometimes the liberals are really wrong in a sense, or foolish, and you can joke and be cynical and stuff, and then sometimes conservatives, they're objectively wrong in their position, but you can learn from maybe what they're saying. Rarely, but you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to be so one-sided and so like for example, I'll give you a good example of what I think about this. When Ginsburg died, I saw one of two responses by leftists, universally. One was they're crying. The other one was that they were laughing. They're both perverted, They're laughing because, they're still in their diaper rebellion against the Democrats. Listen, was anyone else just like me who just didn't give a shit and didn't even think anything of it, wasn't emotionally attached at all, and just was like, oh, yeah, she died? Because that was literally my reaction when I saw it. And then that's what I mean by not being so caught up in the fucking bullshit. You really have to have a global perspective. And if you have a global perspective, you're going to be able to understand that the political division that exists in America does not reflect the realities of real politics. Real politics is not manifested at this site here. Real politics is something you need to be able to see with infrared vision, and having an international perspective allows you to see that. Having an international or a global perspective allows you to distill the bullshit from the chit-chat. And 99% of what's going on in America, I don't care who they are, they're leftists or they're rightists, it's chit-chat, right? It's just chit-chat. If you have a more global perspective, you're able to be indifferent. You're able to see this as a false division. And a lot of shit is just a kind of false division in America. Division over nothing. Now, there is a real objective division, of course, the class struggle and so on and so on, but it's not always, it's not reducible to the explicit terms of its articulation between Democrats and Republicans. Look, you go to any community, you show me a conservative, I'll flip you a liberal. The same family members, the same, it's just a matter of your personality. What kind of type of person you are. It's not some, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not the real fundamental division. You need to have this kind of populistic sense. Mao understood the distinction between primary and secondary contradictions. The primary contradiction is the class struggle and all that stuff, we know. But there's also a secondary contradiction, if you want, which is between the people and the establishment, right? Without an acute sense of this contradiction, there would be no revolution in Russia, because there would be no land reform. The Bolsheviks would have simply sided with the Mensheviks and allied with the established bourgeoisie instead of the anti-establishment bourgeoisie that existed in the countryside and was hungry for land. And I don't even have to mention the experience of China because it's self-evident. But you get my point. And every corresponding successful revolution in history was based in an acute sense of the two. I mean, this is even a kind of limited way of putting it, but if you're a basic Maoist, you should understand the primary and the secondary contradiction. They're two co-temporal and yet not the same thing. If you, for example, if you substitute sense of the secondary contradiction for the primary contradiction, you are going to inevitably side with the establishment. Think about it. I'm in a university and I need theory in order to understand the concept of class struggle, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. I'm an academic, right? I require theory in order to come to these conclusions about class struggle that I found in the university or the academy, right? How did I arrive at that position? Through university, through the institution, through the establishment. Inevitably, if I base my entire reality on this reflexivity, I'm going to resent people who don't have access to this knowledge or simply don't find it commonsensical or have no reason to accept it. I'm going to side with the establishment and say, everyone's stupid except me. I have this insight into the truth and no one else does. But on the other hand, if you have an acute sense of the secondary contradiction, you'll be able to see that very same, the object of the primary contradiction, which you have called the class struggle, is actually the same object as the secondary contradiction. It's just manifesting itself in a different way, a way that's not reducible to the terms of its articulation and thought, something that's happening in actual reality under your fucking nose. The revolution is underway under your fucking nose. There's a huge anti-establishment sentiment. There's the establishment is crumbling by this tsunami of the people that's coming, right? These things are happening. It's just that because the two contradictions are estranged from one another, it's not clear. But that's the significance of Maoism, was to make this precisely clear. This is why Mao, for the first time, allowed the millions, hundreds of millions of people who were considered outside of civilization, outside of enlightenment, to have some kind of recognition. You know, there was an article recently that was like, this Chinese strategy from Mao was to find a base in the countryside to overthrow the cities. And they said, China's trying to do the same now. Mao did the same thing with his international perspective. He's trying to get all of the rural countries against the urban center of the first world, and so on and so on. It's interesting, you know? All right, Ezra just joined, and he's going to piggyback off of what I just said, even though he didn't hear it.
Well, I think, the issue of the secondary contradiction, because it's not just a theory, it's also a practical lesson learned through, almost through various hardships, the Chinese Communist Party had endured throughout the first stage of the Civil War, and then later the Sino-Japanese War. Or is that there is a necessity. Sometimes because the class contradiction between proletariat and bourgeoisie is always the fundamental contradiction, but it's the formal consideration is important, because you cannot pretend just to be opposed to the, at that time for the Chinese Communist Party, that's the nationalist government, that's like you cannot oppose them at the same time when there's at that time the primary contradiction for Mao is the national contradiction almost between the Chinese people as a whole and the invading Japanese imperialist power. And then as conditions shift, the role of the primary secondary reversed dialectically too. I think it's an important concept to consider today in the United States, especially when what does it mean to be, what even is a proletariat, what even is a bourgeoisie? It's not a given, not just subjectively, it's not a given. It's not even a given that people directly relate, almost on an objective level. I'm not sure if it's the correct way to put it. But that doesn't mean to oppose the establishment through a united nationhood or a united sense of the people as a whole is a betrayal, because it is on a deeper objective level you advance the even the class struggle to a much greater degree than any pretension of proletariat unites, like you don't give a shit about the rest of the people, or pretend the national reality doesn't exist.
It's because you mentioned the issue of the proletariat and bourgeoisie in America, and it's such a tip of the iceberg thing, as far as we didn't even get to the real problem of Marxism theoretically, which is it's dug a deep hole for itself. The dogmatic Western Marxists have no ability to relate to the world as it exists today whatsoever. All of these ideas that they're talking about, proletariat, bourgeoisie, and then you can even go the theory of value, the value form itself, commodity production, the forces of the race, all of these things that they talk about, the base and superstructure, they can only dogmatically impose upon the world, but there's always things about the world that they're never going to be able to appreciate as long as they're steeped. This is what I would say, is that essentially Marxism is correct, but the form by which we can relate to this correctness is not given. But for most Marxists in the West, it is given. In order to understand what the proletariat is, all you need is a neat little definition that says someone who doesn't own the means of production. But then you gotta, which means that a graduate student is a proletarian. Can you believe that shit? I mean, it's betraying any meaningful common sense that is connoted by the word proletariat that's always existed, but we only accept it because of some formal bullshit that no one ever agreed upon or was never given or dogmatically implied in the first place. So that's another big point of distinction we have with Marxists, is we accuse them of formalism, we accuse them of dogmatism, and we think they simply are unable to relate to the world today at all. I mean, in what meaningful sense, besides of a few niche people we know of on Twitter, in what meaningful sense are Marxists today able to establish, in the West, I mean, a brilliant analysis of the world or the economy? No one. It's always coming from non-Marxists who have something interesting to say. It's always coming from people outside of the dogma, you know? And that's the interesting thing that is, speaking of things that are happening under the nose of Marxists in the West, is that the biggest division between East and West in Marxism cannot really be put on explicit theoretical terms, because Marxism-leninism in the East is never considered to be reducible to a theoretical explication whatsoever. There's a certain Maoist brilliance that is simply given in China. But you have to ask this question: how is this brilliance given in China, in the Communist Party and even the people, in a sense, when you cannot find anywhere a code of laws where this is all simply made explicit in all its wealth and all its depth and all its complexity and its applicability to the world and so on? And the answer is that there is an index of accumulated experience of Marxism-Leninism that is subterranean. It is below the surface. It's below the sea. It's unconscious. It's in all the deepest Freudian, metaphysical, whatever connotations of the word. In both Russia and China and elsewhere, there's an accumulated index of Marxist-Leninist experience that, while is not enunciated explicitly, is still recalled as a matter of deeper sense. You don't need to read books by Badiou in China to understand the meaning of primary and secondary contradiction. It only suffices to point to an example, and then it's just an I see what you mean moment. You know what I mean? And there's an accumulation of that kind of intuitive sense in Eastern Marxism-Leninism, where you just simply have an aha moment, and then not only are you able to see the meaning of it in this specific instance, it's not like some English common law or something, you're able to actively apply it to other things as well. It opens up, it unlocks aspects of reality that that weren't before. It makes things intelligible that were not before intelligible about reality. And I think the way that you could put this in the Western thinking, I think, would be almost like Deleuze's idea of transcendental empiricism. Now, it's a really brief rundown. For Kant, the transcendental, we know his thing, the transcendental aesthetic is one thing, or two things, right? It's space and time, or something like that, right? Deleuze goes so far as to refuse to define any one object of the transcendental aesthetic. For Deleuze, the transcendental aesthetic, which is experience beyond the threshold of, I don't know, the surface, consciousness, maybe for him the signifier, is a matter of active and recurrent. It's a experience. It's a wealth. It's a reality that has depth and wealth that must be actively and continually discovered. It's called transcendental empiricism in a similar way as the regular kind of empiricism to nature. It means there's a lot of shit in nature, right? And empiricism means we're discovering different ways of relating to them by the senses. For Deleuze, it's the same thing with the transcendental reality, is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of shit out there, right? And then the new Deleuzians, they have this idea of the hyper object, and you have the whole thing about speculative materialism, maybe is another word for transcendental empiricism. It's all kind of talking about the same thing, but all of this stuff, again, which is coming from Heidegger ultimately, this ways of thinking, this is the only way you can translate Marxism-Leninism into Western terms, meaningful Western terms. if you try to import Eastern Marxism at face value in the West, you're going to end up with clownery and absurdity. So we've been getting some questions by our viewers, and they've been asking us, they're like, how are you guys? First of all, here's the crazy, they're just so surprised by this. They're telling us, first of all, you're Marxist-Leninists? What? Second of all, you're dealing with all this theory stuff that only university people deal with. So those two are already bizarre combination. But to make matters worse, you're talking about Bernie Sanders as though it has some practical significance. And you're talking about the Bernie movement. You guys are suck dems. You're just a whole batch of contradictions and insanity roiled into one. If only you had a true dialectic sense, my friend, because you would be able to see how all of those things you mentioned beautifully and harmoniously complement each other. And it's funny people ask this question, and the only response you need to give is, again, we just talked about what Westerners do with Marxism-Leninism in the East, but you also do this in your own countries when phenomena rears its head. You call Bernie's movement suck dem just because of the explicit statements and claims of its leaders. But by doing so, you've committed two problems. The first problem is a very obvious one. The objective essence of the movement is not reducible to the explicit appearance given to it by its leaders. That's an obvious materialist 101. So that's an easy shit, right? But the second error you've committed is worse. You've committed a violent Cartesian reduction whereby, or a Kantian reduction, you can either one, whereby you have made it seem like something that's contingent exists for itself as a universal whatever maxim. When they say we want universal healthcare, just because they didn't mention we want a communist world, which by the way is not a materialist position or statement, doesn't mean they're elevating this as a final goal that exists for itself. They're speaking to a reality that is concrete and is real in the present tense. They're speaking to the contradictions in the American politics as they actually exist. When you accuse them of being suck dems because of what they did not do, not because of what they're actually doing, but because of what they did not do, you're knocking on an open fucking door. No one mentioned anything about that shit you're talking about. The burden of proof lies upon you to make that somehow meaningful or of any practical relevance. What the fuck does it mean to call yourself a fucking communist? You're just talking about things you don't want. Oh, I don't want a society where there's money. What does that mean practically? What does that even fucking mean? You can't even tell me what that means. Oh, I'm a communist because I want there to be no private property. Okay, but what does that entail? What does that mean? I'll tell you what it entailed in the Soviet Union and Russia. It entailed a land reform that gave small allotments of plots of land to peasants. That's what it entailed. In China, I'll even make the argument, it entails socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's how they saw it. So what does that entail for you? Because you can't collapse the essence and the appearance. There's a discontinuity. You've only arrived at a negative truth. You've said communism is a stateless, classless. Okay, but you haven't actually arrived at the positive meaning of that. You've mistaken the positive meaning for the negative one. You've mistaken the form for the positive meaning. Form is always negative. Tell me what that means concretely. If you want to get to the real stuff about concrete reality, you got to leave your little pseudo-Marxist study group or your little cult. You got to leave your kindergarten and you got to go out in the real world and be given to that. And it's tough. It's brutal. It's humiliating. Because why is it humiliating? Because it's always going to humiliate you. It's always going to change your perceptions. You're not going to have any preemptive knowledge going forward that's going to, exempt you from the constant humbling nature of practice, which changes what you think about the world. You may know the world negatively, and abstractly doesn't mean you know it positively and concretely. It's so funny how so-called radical leftists will be like, well, look at what happened to Corbyn and Bernie, told you so. No one ever made the assumption you're saying. Nobody, like, it's, and by the way, you didn't know anything. If you, what's that quote in Faust or Goethe or something?
Well, all that is the one that Marx likes.
No, the one quote that says, "Better if nothing came to be."
Yeah.
What is the full quote?
That's
yeah,
Faust.
all that exists
Deserves to perish.
will perish. So better if nothing came to be. If you hold that position, you'll always be right. No matter what fucking happens. We're all gonna die, man. We're all gonna die one day. So and the same is true for movements and states even. If you just hold that lazy position, you'll turn out to be right eventually. But you know what you won't accomplish? Getting anywhere. Oh. Didn't think about that now, did you? You only thought about this abstract, formal idea of being right. And you're not even right. Because you weren't... In order to be right, you have to prove it in a particular way. What do I mean by that? If you're betting on the stock market, you can't just say all stocks will eventually go down by 5%. You have to choose a specific stock at a specific time. You have to get it right like that. You didn't do that for Bernie or Corbyn. You just said it's all bullshit and everything went to shit eventually, but you didn't make a particular observation or analysis. Doing that requires work. And if you're able to make those types of analyses that are particular and actually concrete, you would be helping the movement. You would be fighting for the leadership of the movement because you're saying it's going to shit unless we lead. In this specific, and this is our concrete specific position, this is what is necessary for victory. If you can prove you had that position once, you would already be the leader of the Western left. Easily. If you could prove once that you said something specific, we need this specific strategy, we need this specific tactic, and we will win without this. And it's something specific and concrete, and you're proven right, you would lead the Western left. Or if you're critiquing a specific tactic and you're saying this specific one is wrong, and there's a clear way in which it's proven that that was the wrong move, congratulations, you gained something called, in Grand Theft Auto terminology, street cred, right? What's that game where it's like that, Saints Row? You gained reputation. You gain reputation. You know, you gain the XP points. People will see that shit and they'll be like, wow, you were right. That's street cred, right?
And I think there's kind of an irony to the like the leftists who make this like criticism too. Like they knew it was gonna go bad. Because the irony is that it's precisely because of these kinds of leftists that the Bernie and Corbyn movement failed. It's precisely because of these kind of radical leftists who are disconnected from objective reality and putting their own kind of like special meaning upon any like kind of social or political movement instead of like embracing it for what it is and really embracing like really taking the mantle of the people's will. It's precisely because of these kinds of leftists that the Bernie and the Corbyn movement got bogged down. It's because Bernie and Corbyn were trying to almost like appeal to these like sort of woke leftists who were giving these impossible cultural demands that got increasingly more and more ridiculous. Like by the end of it, Corbyn was like saying he was going to like make animal rights reforms and whatnot that had nothing to do, with like the original, core of his movement. And so I think there's like an irony to this because like they are what I would say a big part of the problem.
Discounting animal rights, because I think that is bullshit, both abstractly and concretely. But I'm not going to rant about that here. I'll tell you the tragedy of Sanders and Corbyn. Concrete truth and concrete victory was sacrificed in the name of things that were abstractly true. So what do I mean by that? Problems were raised on the basis of abstract problems. Technically, it is true that abstractly, yes, it is true. I don't know. Let's even say yes, abstractly, it is true. Capitalism should be or must be abolished or will be abolished, right? Concretely, what does that mean? You see what I mean? When you exhibit this notion abstractly, you're coming at the expense of the actual concrete truth of this abstraction. So you stifle concrete victory because you're being tempted by abstract truths. Technically, the U.S. is founded upon cis heteropatriarchal exposition of native land and slavery and white supremacy. Yes, that's all true. So Bernie's movement was tempted by this truth, this abstract truth, and it saw this as sufficient ground to give concessions to the self-anointed disciples of this truth, the ones who considered themselves to have the solution to this problem. So we're gonna have more lip service. We're gonna have more woke language and shit. All you did was alienate the population, though. You see what I mean? Whereas in actual fact, to concretely relate to this reality of native genocide and then slavery and all this kind of stuff, entailed fidelity to the concrete needs of the movement, which means putting a fucking muzzle on the meaningless pseudo-radical language, so you don't just right off the bat antagonize 90% of fucking people.
I think that they want to be able to solve these things, indigenous, without having the power, the basis to do this, and because they've not established that power basis first, they demand that it comes first on the agenda, so to speak. It's almost like what you said with like primary and secondary contradictions, what Mao said. Yes, these are problems, but you only get this first by establishing trust and a basis in the people. That comes first.
And by the way, that's only in terms of educating them about it, which is a cultural thing. Educating people about the crimes against Native Americans. Yeah, that's cultural though. That's doing something that's real in relation to the predicament of native, whatever, I don't know if they like to be called this, Indians. That has nothing to do with, that's not just a matter of culture. It's a concrete thing. It's about giving them land and all this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? It has nothing to do with merely acknowledging something. And by the way, the thing that they were demanding everyone acknowledge was just negative. Let's acknowledge America is founded by sin. No one wants to dwell in a bitchy, negative fucking world. Let me tell you, man, life's already a bitch. People are jobless and struggling for jobs. Jobs went overseas. The way of life is being destroyed. You don't think they have enough of a bitchy reality? They're living it, man. You're just a fucking college student or a graduate student in a graduate student union, and you don't have enough of the bitchy reality, so you have to make one abstractly. People are already living it. If you only give people negativity, America's sinful. So what do you have to offer? What is your fucking point? If you have a point, get to that point instead of this stupid iconoclasm that you are so content with dwelling in. No one likes a whiner, and no one likes someone who just bitches as a way of life. In order to live, I'm going to be like a self-help guy, but living means positivity in a way, right? Living means waking up and just living, persisting. If you dwell in negativity all the fucking time, that's no way for a fucking human being to live. Just say what you want to say and say everyone should die. You know what I mean by that, in a way? Just tell people they should just fucking drop dead. Like, what do you fucking want? At the end of the day, you gotta wake up and eat and work. That's life. You need to acknowledge America was founded. But what's your fucking point? You know what I mean? Like, get to the point. You just want people to acknowledge it? No, but I'll tell you what they'll say. They'll say, well, the first step to doing anything about it is acknowledging it. No, it's not. It's the last step. First of all, you don't know what the positive consequence of that is. It's not necessarily true that all of America is a nihil because of what you're saying. There's a reality to America that isn't just that. There's a deeper reality to the thing you're saying. You know? There's more to it than that. Or the implication of that is not reducible to the appearance of a horrible crime. And there's other implications too, you know, that you got to draw out with work. I hate to be the type, you know, that says, like with Zizek, like, the same thing that was bad also gives rise to the opportunity for something good. And I don't fully buy that, but there's an extent to which it's true, you know? Like, that should allow you to clarify the good instead of just dwelling and bitching about the bad, you know, about America, I mean, and the American nation specifically.
I think it has a lot to do with like this kind of way of thinking where we supposedly want to get to like the deep, dark reality of things. But I think in some ways, when you get down to like the deep, dark reality of things and so on, you end up missing the bigger picture because you end up missing the appearance. There's kind of a truth to the appearance of good, even when there's like, you know, evil beneath it. And I think almost a commitment to that appearance of good is like precisely what's needed, because I think that appearance is more than just like superficial, more than just like an ideological lie, but actually represents something redeemable about America. Like, you know, as an American citizen, or like as a someone who's taking like a political stance or being a partisan, if you're coming from an American standpoint, I think you do still need to like face yourself in this kind of like idea of America as being, you know, this experiment of democracy and of Enlightenment principles. It's just that you have to commit yourself more deeply to that than the actual founding fathers and so on were capable of doing in their context.
Here, I think you're muted.
I'm a clown. You also have to be delivered to the oceanic reality of America, the one that isn't written anywhere in history books, right? The American people, the story of the American people. Democracy, what does it mean? It means, you know, demos, democracy. It's about people. So there's also this unconscious reality you have to be delivered to that can't really be put in explicit terms. But I really like how you put it, because about the good specifically, because if you think about it, what is the motif of the era? The good or the sun was fake, and now we're dealing with this issue of the beautiful. The good was a lie, Platonic good, right? The form of forms, the center, the father, whatever, the state. It was all based on a false myth. And now we've taken the red pill and we're in the matrix, and this is the real reality, and all that's left is this question of the sublime, the beauty, the beautiful, sorry. Beauty is the only real thing. Why? Because when we see the good as debased, it is by means of a phenomenal appearance or as an object of the aesthetic that we perceive the good as debased. Right? The form of forms is, let's say, Rome. Caesar was killed, or Christ was crucified. Maybe it's the same story. I'm not going to get into that. Something happens, though, in phenomenal reality that debases the good. So the good cannot be redeemed, but there can only be a striving for beauty, which is what? The realization of perfection in phenomenal reality. This is the theme of media. It's the theme of everything. It's also the theme of the contemporary left and its idea of communism. Communism is a cultural and aesthetic idea. It's a realization of perfection in the world as an object of phenomenal sense. Whereas before in the past, maybe you had a utopianism, but communism was never an idea in the sense of a phenomenal object. It was never a thing where we said, this is how it will be, and if it's any other way, it's bullshit. You know how leftists in America say that? You can keep your revolution. It's bullshit. Unless you acknowledge ableism, it's bullshit. You know, they say all these kind of things because it's an aesthetic object. It's all about appearance. It's all about beauty. Anyway, I'm rambling. The whole point about what you said about seeing appearance of the good, there's a truth in it, is to arrive at the insight that the good, the Platonic good, never pretended to worldly perfection. The form of forms was never reducible to any phenomenal appearance in the first place. You only made the assumption it was after the good was debased. The appearance of the good was debased. To have a higher sense of the good, and even you can even think about this in terms of what is the meaning of Maoist goodness of the people, Stalinist or Maoist, because they say the goodness of the people. It's a very common Maoist motif. How can you say the goodness of the people? The people rape, lie, cheat, and all these bad things. And then leftists will go, well, how can you say there's patriarchy and there's racism? Okay. Because when you say the goodness of the people, you're referring to something that's not reducible to what is formally intelligible on the surface. That's the meaning of the goodness of the people. So to see the goodness of the American people doesn't mean to excuse all the crimes and hideous shit. It just means to acknowledge there's a reality that's not on the surface that is ultimately what is called the good, the form of forms.
It's the same reason that any idea of communism is a kind of final eschatological reality is already mistaken, you know?
Absolutely mistaken. Communism, maybe not even as just a final eschatological sublime. You've had that maybe in the past, and it's just truth in it. What is absolutely false is the idea of communism as a total culturalization of the world, where we render everything, the economic laws, the material reality, every single thing in the world becomes subjugated by the dominion of culture, where we can establish rules and social association on purely explicit terms. There's no unconscious, there's no deeper reality, there's no material reality. It's all a contractual reality. What do you know? Of course people critique this as bourgeois. It's fundamentally bourgeois, right? I just said it, contractual. We go back to where? Who? Locke and all those assholes. Right? The English theorists of statehood. Bentham. the English egotist. Yes. What's absolutely false is an idea of communism. I mean, I feel disgusted saying it because Marx already said it. And everyone always quotes Marx, but I don't think they really understand what he was trying to say. Communism isn't a society you want to establish. It's a real movement toward, not the abolition, that's an American word, it's a retarded word. The Russian equivalent to that word is liquidation. They had a word for it in Russian. Liquidation. And liquidationism was a tendency that the Bolsheviks were fiercely opposed to. Not to abolish the present state of things, but Marx said to sublate them, to aufheben. He put it in the Hegelian terms. So what does that mean? It means there is an objective movement that attests to some kind of transformation that is happening. Not something you want to happen, it is happening. And this is what we're calling communism. So to be explicitly a communist, all that means is that you're someone who acknowledges that. It doesn't mean there's no there's no component to that where it says, I want society to be this way. No, being a communist just means you're acknowledging something no one else is acknowledging. Or you're acknowledging it in a unique way. Why did Engels call it scientific socialism? Why didn't he just say socialism, but we're also going to be scientific? No, he called it scientific socialism. Why? Because to be a scientific socialist means you're acknowledging something in a scientific way that not only others are not acknowledging who aren't socialists, but even the socialists who are acknowledging it aren't acknowledging it in a scientific way. Right? So, but another thing about this question of socialism is that it goes back to this question of the culturalization of the economy and politics. And yeah, I think you asked me about something regarding what I said about China and why it cannot really be said China isn't socialist.
Yeah, particularly because it was in reference to something that you had
false
said.
Equivalence of public property with socialist ownership.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was it.
And more particularly with private property itself.
Exactly. Yeah. What people don't understand is that people think socialism or communism, the end of private property, simply means everything becoming public state property. No, that's not the historical experience. In fact, public property is what's the bourgeois notion. What is public property? It's owned by who, right? It's an abstraction. The state is an abstraction. It's the same abstract state as the bourgeois state that owns. This is the commons of bourgeois society. Is an anonymous, universal, not determinate or particular type of ownership. State and public ownership exists in all societies after modernity, and it is only as a necessity. It's a pragmatic reality. It's not because it's more virtuous for the state or how Jacobin magazine wants to put it. Well, the state will be more caring for people because, you know what I mean? This kind of bullshit. No, the state ownership is something that is where the economy has a political, strategic, whatever dimension for the state. And the state must own it because they can't trust people with owning it, because if people owned it privately, it's always like a temporary burden. It's always privatization is always better in the bourgeois society, and maybe even in general, because it makes something that was a burden into something that just works by itself. We as the state can privatize something because this no longer threatens the strategic integrity of the state or the welfare of the people, whatever you want, in a socialist, what we call today's 21st century socialism that already won. Anyway, no, the real stakes of socialism, or at least Marxism, whatever you want to call it, is not in the public ownership. It's in the strange and bizarre, almost unintelligible type of ownership. And the reason it's so paradoxical and unintelligible is because it's in between the very contradiction between the universal form and the determinate private particular. And what is the first form of this? It's the kolkhozes under Stalin, the Stalin era. Kolkhozes were not public property. Stalin hinted that the kolkhozes were the true form of communistic property. It's a false assumption to say that public property was the communist, that it will evolve in the form of public property simply swallowing the kolkhozes. He said no, it can be the opposite is true. Maybe there's a more decentralization, sorry. Maybe it means public property, something will happen to it, and the kolkhozes are the model for the future socialist ownership. You see, the issue with a universal public property is the same issue Marx critiqued of the bourgeois state. It's not that, you can't own everything because of the pragmatic reason it'll be inefficient. No, ontologically it's not possible for universal public ownership. Why? Because economic reality is something objective. It's something material and objective. It's a simple thing all Marxists can accept. You cannot legislate the material premises of the economy. You cannot do it. You cannot legislate them by decree. This is idealism. It's voluntarism. You can only submit to the economic laws, objective economic laws, but you can't establish them ex nihilo. The problem of Marxists, chiefly Western Marxists, they have reduced the materiality of the economy to the only as the technological forces of production, which lacks any human element. The machines and the nature and the science and this is what they have said is the material forces of production. They neglect that the relations of production are also a material site. The relations of production are also material. Unless, what do you mean? They're hardwired into? No, that's the whole point. They're not physiologically reducible, but they're still material. You know what I mean? They're still objective and real. Maybe they're not the same as the same thing as an animal instinct, but it's still this is why psychoanalysis is important. It exists and you can discern it in the unconscious and symptoms and so on and so on. Well, anyway, if the material forces of production are also material relations of production are also material, there's a universal ownership of the means of production is fucking absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Because what does that mean? It means you're replacing material relations of production with some ideal of what they should be, the relations of production. And in the West, in America, it's so silly. And this is why we don't want to mention them. This is why we're not bred to. Because we don't say, the workers' ownership of the... No, that's cultural. You're not talking about anything material. Workers' ownership of the means of production. Socialistic ownership of means of production is not something you can legislate. It's only something that can emerge accidentally, in a sense. And what do I mean by that?
Accidentally, and maybe not even in the form in which they think it is.
That's what I mean more. That's more what I mean. That's more what I mean. The kolkhozes, for example, they were... You
can't legislate... Maybe put it this way, that you can't legislate the form in which this takes.
Exactly,
Workers underneath, for an example.
The kolkhozes, they weren't entirely voluntary, but the kolkhozes opened up a reality that that was neither legislated beforehand, the reality of the peasants, the particular reality of the peasants in the country, nor was it a reality whose ultimate outcome anyone could have decided beforehand. In the form of the kolkhozes themselves, the peasants were burdened with improvising and dealing with all of these minute, small details and realities to meet those quotas. You can't know what that's going to be like beforehand by some central state. You can't. You simply can't.
The reason why maybe that this is socialistic.
It's the only form of social. I would argue it was the only socialistic.
Yeah,
it was the only real state.
This is where we want to avoid being textualist, but this is where free association and submitting to laws beyond you comes into play.
Exactly.
That is where
it's where socialism acquires determinate and particular form. It's not just this universal state owning everything. Here, in the void of private reality, if you want, something socialistic can emerge, right? Which you cannot preemptively. This is why we're Heideggerians, in a sense, right? And then Maoism complicates it even more, going beyond the kolkhozes and so on. And then with socialism with Chinese characteristics, it gets even more interesting and more interesting. But we can't talk about it all here, right? Because it will take too much time. But I think the main takeaway, the main point of this should be what distinguishes us infrared. We are Marxist-Leninists, we are communists and so on. But if you're watching this, right? Everything you think you know about what those words mean, we argue is wrong. That's what we're about. That's where we're coming from. It's all wrong. You got it all wrong. And it's so severely wrong to the point where up is down and left is right. You will think we are conservatives and we're rightists. It's so far out there in terms of how we see this that it's almost like there's no common ground. I don't even want to critique breadtube people because what do we have to do with them? Nothing, right? Like, and that's kind of what the reason we made this show is because we think that what we are about isn't really being given adequate representation anywhere else. We think we are really a unique thing we have going on. I'm talking about in the West, okay? In elsewhere outside of America, there's a lot of common ground, a lot of interesting things going on. But I'm just talking about specifically in terms of dogmatic, Talmudistic. I'm not saying an anti-Semitic way. I'm saying Stalin's criticism, Marxism that exists in the West. To clarify, that's why we feel more closer to non-American and somewhat non-Western left.
By Western Marxism was a mistake.
Absolutely. I mean, if by Western Marxism we mean Lukács, who destroyed Marxism in the West, theoretically. His Kantianization of Marxism was the death knell of Marxism. And anyone who says read Lukács, I'll say for every Lukács, there's a Kolakowski is his name? Leszek Kolakowski. The Pole. Yeah. For every Lukács, there's one of him, because he's the conclusion. It's simply liberalism, Kantianized liberalism. That's Western Marxism. The only interesting Marxism in the West was happening after Heidegger. Kojève, Bataille in France, all those French thinkers coming after this Franco-Germanic dialogue that was happening, which also somewhat gave rise to decolonial theory. Fanon came from these people, right? Or is influenced by them. The Iranian intellectuals were influenced by them. So all the interesting things were happening in terms of the West, were happening there. And its corresponding influences in the third world. It's happening there, right? Western Marxism is for nerds. Sorry, it's for academic nerds who want to feel like they're orthodox and Marxism, they're doing it by the book, so they feel safe and comfortable. When you read Bataille, you're doing nothing by the book. There's no guarantee or safety you're doing it correctly whatsoever. You have to discover the essence of Marxism by means formally unfamiliar to you. And I think that is the only correct position people who live in the West like us can have. We're not trying to appear like we're so much more enlightened and smarter than all of you are. We really just want to share it with people because we think there's people out there who do agree with us and who maybe are out there like us, but who aren't really being given representation. Their voices are not really being heard. And
that maybe they don't have the words for this, but they do have
exactly.
A sense that
we don't think we're geniuses, we're smarter than everybody, and you just have to listen to us and whatever. We think that for accidental reasons, we want to bring interesting people who aren't being given representation together. And the real target is not you, the viewers, as a regular person. The real target is the institutionalized Marxism that is up there in the ivory towers in the academia. That's the target of, I'm not trying to say, we're so much smarter than everybody. I'm trying to say those of us Marxists who are out there, those guys like us, what's that movie who's like, if you're out there, the X-Men? If you're out there, let me cringe. Whatever. I'm just trying to say, if you're out there, we can muster the courage to take this shit over. You know what I'm saying? We don't gotta be bounded by this kind of blackmail of the institutionalized Marxism of the academic establishments and all these nerds and shit.
Not that we're any comparable, but think about Lenin. I mean, Lenin was considered a rightist by a great many Marxists in his own day. He was shot by a leftist, Fanny Capital.
We're not even in that league, you know that.
We're not. But it is.
But it's a good example. You're right, 100%. And Mao was the same thing. thing. Yeah, believe it or not, wasn't Mao, Ezra, maybe you know about this, wasn't Mao less favored by the Soviet establishment in the beginning? They preferred others, right?
I think so. Not just specifically Mao specifically. I think he just wasn't, in the beginning, he wasn't even considered because if you look at the early CCP history, it's a bunch of other failures, but almost for the exact reason that we talked about here, who are very much more or less dogmatist, who are their Bolshevism is very much the bad parts of Bolshevism relative to Maoism, if that makes sense. It's very westernized, it's exclusively urban focused. It's
Ezra, wasn't the I might be wrong, but didn't I think the original CCP members, a lot of them turned to Trotskyism because of this reason?
No, some turned to Japan, right?
Some turned to Trotskyism, but it's not necessarily Trotskyism that's a problem, because Trotsky was so demonized among the Comintern. But Japan was a big thing.
Yes.
And then just defection to KMT, all of them. Just people you have this process of people just dogmatically assume the proletariat appearance that is in the West, trying to extrapolate this to China, even though China's proletariat is the status of the Chinese proletariat is debatable at best at that time, and then Mao is the first person to talk about a sort of a return, like going to the people in the sense of going to the countryside, going to the peasantry, and it was extremely controversial both in the Comintern and within the Chinese Communist Party itself. It's lots of contestation, theoretical and practical confrontation, and eventually he won out, almost out of practical necessity in a way. That's because the party was basically destroyed by all its attempt, and they did try all its attempt being almost purely urban mobilization. But Mao was certainly considered as like a deviation of someone that's not only deviated from Mao, but even deviates from Lenin. Like someone who's almost good, I guess a right-winger. I'm not sure if he's explicitly called that, but it's something like that. So it's really a internal revolution that the Chinese Communist Party have to go to in order even to progress. And like I said before, they learned the hard way. They was almost annihilated multiple times throughout the 20s and 30s before they finally come to the conclusion that something different needs to be done. That's the predominant notion that the Marxists at the time that they have needs to be completely reevaluated.
And that's why I think it's kind of absurd now. Is it's like what we're doing isn't really new. What we're doing should be common sense for anyone who's looking at history. All this shit happened I mean, if you're a Marxist or an academic Marxist who's watching this and is so mad about heterodox and shit we are, man, you were those people in the Comintern in the Chinese and Soviet establishments of the Communist Party who didn't like Mao, but Mao's the one who won. And this story repeats itself across history. Lenin was the same thing. Every concrete victory of Marxists anywhere was the same thing. Or of a Communist Party anywhere was the same story. It's the same story of going against the establishment. And you really got to think to yourself, if you're really, watching this and you're butthurt and shit, you got to think about, like, today in 2020, where are you? Like, who are you, right? Like, where would you be back then? So where are you now, right? You would be with that establishment. And I can't see how people, like, guys, there's literally people who will watch this and be like, well, you still believe the value form shouldn't be abolished, so you're not a Marxist. And they'll really say that. Like, where do you think you look like saying that in a historical perspective? Like, where are you right now? You an establishment dogmatic little bad bitch. Sorry to say. You're not the type. Your thinking is not the one that's gonna carry the proletariat to victory. It's just not.
At the same time, I do think it's kind of a fad nowadays, at least as far as I can see, where you do have a lot of leftists in the United States who condemn theory and theory talk, supposedly for this reason. They'll hear this stuff and they'll hear, yeah, we need to go back to common sense. You're thinking, stop telling people to read shit, but it's not that either. The point is obviously to be, like you said, to kind of...
because they think common sense means abolish the police, and that's common sense.
Exactly. And they think they can skip the point of theory is to clarify this, is to put something like this, not abolish the police, but like abolish value form, discover what is concrete about that today. It's not to impose that on reality. You know what I mean?
You want to know something?
Like, they reverse it.
The phrase abolish the value form is the most retarded fucking thing you can say.
Yeah.
It's so fucking stupid. How can you fucking say abolish it? What the fuck? Abolish it? Do you actually think the value form is legislated somewhere? It's a statute. It's a civil code you abolish, you fucking idiot. You can't abolish it. The form itself can only be sublated. You can't abolish that. It doesn't make sense.
It's the same thing for everything, with the family, with the state, and this stuff is common sense, but you'll have the same people say abolish the value form, abolish wage labor. But these things are not like they're not objects of thought that you can arbitrate. You know what I mean? Like how do you do that? But that's like you said, that's where if you are acquainted with the history of Marxism, you'll see that what this means in practice. In Russia, in China.
In America, they're trying to draw parallels to the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. But guess what, guys? The difference with that is that there was the element of formally instantiated human bondage involved, which means people were legally recognized as property. So you can't
directly
abolish
political.
That. You can't abolish that because it's directly formally there. When you're talking about capitalism, or when you're talking about the value form, or you're talking about the family and all these things, that's not there. There's no set of laws you can repeal or revise that are going to change these realities, because they're not a matter of law. Whereas slavery, and actually slavery wasn't entirely a matter of law either. Slavery as an objective reality somewhat has persisted, even to this day. Right? But it's still meaningful to say abolish slavery. But that did not eliminate the reality of slavery. No one would argue that in 2020, I don't think. But there was something meaningful about abolishing slavery. It wasn't meaningful because slavery meant people were in bondage in a legally recognized way.
Yeah.
And, it's...
But I think that's another... Just going back to what we said before, I think that's another way in which we're straddling a kind of, and it's a bad word to use, but a kind of centrism. Because on the one hand, it's not an overemphasis on the purity of thought and these kinds of abstractions, and taking this to be an end. But at the same time, it's not the, this kind of, common sense. It's not actually common sense view that you ought to just dispense with theory and what is common sense is to abolish these things. You have to have a dialectic between both and see that theory is clarification of practice, of objectivity, of whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean?
I think it's also like important to remember that in like opposing like established academia and like established theories of knowledge, it's not like for the point of negation. It's because we're like putting forward our own affirmative stance for something that is in opposition to what already exists. But it's not purely like a negative stance on knowledge itself, but a competing theory of knowledge that we're putting forward.
Absolutely. The only reason I mention institutions and academia is because I see how very clearly when we're trying to put forward our positive views, the fact that we lack those credentials gets in the way for so many people. Who are you to say that, It's just because we're not established. And that's the whole point of anti-establishment sentiment. It's when there's a positive striving that an establishment is getting in the way of, Another thing about the so-called, that theory is so inaccessible. I bitched about this in a show. For them, common sense is just, it's still reflexive. It's still this purely reflexive instinct. It's not really common sense. Because as metropolitans, as urban whatever, youth, for them, the negation is almost like already their reality. So it doesn't take much thought to start screaming and screeching, abolish this and abolish that. Because we get it, dude. You're edgy and you want to abolish the world. You want to abolish reality. Your whole position is based on abolishing reality. Because that's what your way of life is. As a petty bourgeois. Listen, if you are a artist or something, I'm not going to hate these people. I don't hate people. Please don't mistake this for... I'm saying as a general phenomena, as a class phenomena. If you are a petty bourgeois, cultural bourgeoisie, your instinct is going to be to abolish reality. Why? Because reality is what limits you. Isn't it what limits you? Like, you still have to eat and feed yourself. You still have, and that's things. Those are things that cannot be negotiated on the terms of your practice. You can't artistically determine how you're going to get food. You cannot intellectually determine how you're going to get food. Those are realities that just humiliate you. And so there's this instinct for these people to just want to abolish reality itself, because they have to. It's something they have to submit to, and which is outside of their control. If that makes sense. That's one way of looking at why they always say abolish this and abolish that. It's because reality itself humiliates them. And they see the things they want to abolish as the thing that prevents them from being able to set the material reality that conditions them on terms controllable by them. They want to control.
I was gonna say, before we wrap things up, I think that is at basis what we feel differentiates our Marxism from the West. Why do we feel special when we talk about this stuff? And if you want to kind of abstract, but I feel like it's also pretty intuitive explanation of this, it's just that for Western Marxists, they see reality as something which is to be domesticated. Their own being, foreignness, whatever is outside them has to be domesticated. That's why they're obsessed with this kind of dogma, this kind of dogmatic adherence to text. It's not that we repudiate these texts, it's just that for them, this is a consolation from the world, right? But the whole point of Marx's critique is to be not only acquainted with, but submit to that which is objective, right? Which can't be so easily domesticated, made an object of thought, which thought is conditional on. You know what I mean? That's why he's a materialist. But this is forgotten.
And the sad thing is that, and like I said, wrapping it up, I think this would be my final critique, I guess, of Western Marxists. The decisive significance of Marxism was always a critique of socialism. Socialism had existed in Marx's time. And Marxism is a specific form of the critique of socialism. It's a socialism, yes, but it's a socialism founded upon the critique of other socialisms. We cannot even afford to say that we just have a problem of a pestilence of non-Marxist socialisms in the left, because they're not socialistic whatsoever. They're not utopian socialists. They're not erratic, interesting socialists. They're not any type of socialist whatsoever. Instead, we have a pestilence of liberalism. And liberalism, which is based in only the negation and the negative rights and all this kind of stuff, and negative freedoms, has encountered its civilizational limit. And out of this paradox, people have convinced themselves that they've discovered the meaning of Marxism, when in fact they're only taking liberalism to its extremes, to the point of total absurdity. Negating absurdity, psychosis, and foreclosure. Nowhere in this is anything similar to Marxism or even socialism in the general sense to be found.
The extremity of liberalism, I think, if I can just put words in your mouth, is a kind of anarchism, or the extent of anarchism is a kind of liberalism. It's and the significance of that is beyond just, the stupidity of the politics. It's that it tries to get rid of its own ground.
Even specifically, Anglo-American anarchism has really nothing to do with Bakunin. They have nothing in common.
Yeah.
Bakunin was an anti-Semite, and he was a pan-Slavist anti-Semite. What does Bakunin have to do with these people? Nothing. Anarchism is a phrase. It has no real meaning in a trans-historical way. But people in America who call themselves anarchists, yeah, they're liberals, edgy liberals. Of course. Name me one. David Graeber, he was kind of interesting. I don't think he was a liberal. He was an interesting guy. But name me one, someone you find who says, I'm an anarchist. It's a liberal, okay? In America. It's a liberal who's edgy, right? And unfortunately, a lot of tankies are that way too. So it's the same thing we're talking about. They're all the same to us, pretty much. Same pathology. You can call yourself a Trotskyist, a Stalinist, a tanky, or an anarchist, or a Maoist, or someone who's very mentally ill, and it's all the same. All right, I think that's a good place to end it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and we really have been enjoying all of your feedback, so keep it up. And hopefully we will have another episode soon.